Good day everyone, my name is Michelle, I hope you're doing well. And in episode 3 of Stories Sunday, I'm going to take you back to 1991 to a small hospital in a town called Grantham in the county of Lincolnshire here in England. This is the story of the nurse Beverley Allitt, who in a killing spree of just 59 days, she murdered 4 children and caused grievous bodily harm to several more. It's a story that is chilling because nurses are meant to save lives, not take them. But let's get into this story. Let's get into the details and what happened eventually to Beverley Allitt. Beverley Gail Allitt was born on the 4th of October 1968. She grew up in the village of Corby Glen, which is a suburb of the town of Grantham in Lincolnshire, which is over the east coast of England. Her father Richard worked at an off-licence. Off-licences in the UK are shops that sell liquor, snacks, essentials. Not a highly paid job. So they didn't have much money when Beverley was growing up with her 3 siblings. But her early life at home was unremarkable, except for the fact that she was accident prone and she was sick a lot of the time. You see, from her earliest years, she exhibited some worrying tendencies, a type of attention-seeking behaviour which ultimately resulted in her becoming a serial killer. These were the first signs of what she would become as a young adult. So while growing up as one of 4 children, she was an attention seeker, and she quickly realised that being sick got her attention, not just from her family, who were unremarkable, just a normal family. If a kid's sick, then you give them attention. But also from the people around her, from her school, her social circle. She would dress herself with bandages and try to put casts over her limbs in an attempt to make out that she'd got a broken bone. However, more often than not, there was absolutely nothing wrong with her. She declined examinations from medics. She just wanted the attention, but she knew there was nothing wrong with her. She became overweight as a teenager, and for whatever reason, this seemed to increase her attention-seeking behaviour. Perhaps as a teenager she was self-conscious. She perhaps didn't get attention from love interests as other people did. So this attention-seeking behaviour, it just continued. She spent considerable time in a hospital for a string of physical ailments, which culminated eventually in the removal of her appendix, that small organ that we don't really need. It's just an afterthought of evolution. But she had it removed, even though we now know there was nothing wrong with her appendix. Also, she was known to self-harm and resorted to doctor hopping. So if one doctor wouldn't give her attention, she'd move on to another. And at her trial, eventually, it was noted in her medical records, going back to the 1980s, that she was attention-seeking, and this was a mental illness. Alice's behaviour in adolescence appeared typical of Munchausen syndrome. And that was a key component of her eventual murderous behaviour and what was said at her trial. When she didn't get the attention she craved, she became aggressive. Her boyfriend that she had at some point during her adolescence said that she was manipulative, deceptive, aggressive. She would hit him. She claimed a false pregnancy to try to keep him. as well as threatening that she would accuse him of rape before the end of the relationship. So he got out. That's all I'm going to say on that one. But schooling was unremarkable. She left school at 16. She attended Charles Reed Secondary Modern School near Grantham, having failed a test that children did at that time. She failed the 11 plus. She failed to get into the grammar school. So this was another knock to her confidence, that she wasn't deemed clever enough. So it added to her, I don't know, lack of self-esteem, I think you would say. But she claimed to love children, and she would often volunteer for babysitting jobs with neighbours. I used to do that kind of thing. I used to babysit when I was a teenager for a few quid. So it's perhaps unsurprising that her dream job when she left school was to become a children's nurse. So she took a nursing course at nearby Grantham College. She struggled though, because she wasn't academically gifted, but also she missed a lot of classes. You know, this was just compounded by the fact that she was sick all the time, or at least claimed to be sick all the time. She eventually, after, failing some classes, but eventually she passed, and she went on the hunt for her dream job, that of a children's nurse. Now, she was turned down for various posts initially because of her lack of experience. She was fresh out of college, but she was a trainee state enrolled nurse. In December 1990, she was fortunate to land a 6-month contract on Ward 4, which is one of the children's ward in the busy but chronically understaffed Grantham Hospital as a trainee. So this would give her that valuable experience that she wanted. She seemed like she was getting her life in order at this point. She could get the experience working with sick children on a children's ward, and then go on to become, an experienced, dedicated children's nurse. But on this ward, at the time, later investigations found that there was only 2 trained, experienced nurses on the day shift and only 1 on the night shift. She started work at the beginning of 1991 on Ward 4, and in the beginning she was a hard worker. She was liked by the other nurses and the doctors, and this hard-working nature was welcomed because of this chronic understaffing. But that welcome was short-lived, and here's why. Let's get into exactly what she did. So on February 21st, 1991, she took the life of her first victim. This was 7 months old, Liam Taylor. He was admitted to Ward 4 with just a chest infection, but because he was a little baby, his parents felt that perhaps he needed to get checked out. They admitted him. It was, just coming out of winter, chest infections and things like that in kids, they are a problem in this kind of wet climate in England. Allitt went out of her way to reassure Liam's parents that he was in capable hands, and she persuaded them to go home and get some rest, and she personally would look after their little baby Liam. But when they left, Liam suffered a respiratory emergency. He was revived, he did recover from that, but she then volunteered for extra night duty. And remember, I said that there's only 1 nurse on the night shift, 1 experienced nurse. So this offer of doing extra shifts really was welcomed by the staff. She was seen as a godsend. So she offered to do these extra night shifts so she could watch over Liam, because she'd assured his parents that she personally was going to take care of him. But the parents didn't leave Liam for very long. But still, Liam had another respiratory crisis. When Allitt was left alone with Liam, his condition got worse. He became deathly pale, blotches appeared on his face, and at this point the emergency resuscitation team was called in. But Allitt's colleagues, the doctors, were confused by the absence of the alarms that should have gone off when Liam was in respiratory crisis. It failed to sound. Why? Liam stopped breathing, and despite efforts to revive him, he suffered massive brain damage, and he remained on a life support machine. On medical advice, his distraught parents were they were advised that Liam was gone, and they turned his life support off. Liam Taylor, aged 7 months, was Allitt's first murder victim. But only 2 weeks after Liam's death, which was recorded formally as heart failure. Bear in mind, Liam had only been admitted to Ward 4 because of a relatively minor chest infection, just for observation really. But only 2 weeks after Liam's death on March the 5th, her next victim was the severely disabled 11-year-old boy, Timothy Hardwick. He suffered with cerebral palsy and epilepsy, and Timothy was admitted to Ward 4 following a seizure, which he had because he had epilepsy. Allitt took over his care, and again, following a period when she was alone with Timothy, she summoned the emergency resuscitation team. Despite their best efforts, which included paediatric specialists, they just brought the experts in. They were like, what's going on here? But they were unable to revive him. And at autopsy, it failed to provide an obvious cause of death. So they just put it down to his seizures. And his epilepsy was officially recorded as his cause of death. We then move on to our third victim, 1-year-old Kayley Desmond, who was admitted on March the 3rd, so she was in around the same time as Timothy. That beginning of March was crucial. This is when Allitt just was hell-bent on killing. She had such a disdain for human life. She claimed to love children. So what the hell was she doing? Doing this to little babies, disabled little boys. What is going on? But Kayley was admitted on March the 3rd with a chest infection. She seemed to be recovering well. However, she stayed in hospital for several days, and 5 days after she was admitted, with Allitt in attendance, Kayley went into cardiac arrest in the same bed that Liam Taylor, where he died a fortnight before. The resuscitation team, however, were able to revive her, and she was moved. The staff were starting to get a bit concerned about all these respiratory arrests in this otherwise, it was a ward for kids who weren't on death's door. These were kids who needed observation, needed attention, but they weren't going to die, right? So they transferred Kayley to the larger, a few miles away, Nottingham Hospital. The attending physician there found odd puncture wounds on Kayley under her armpit during a thorough examination. And, it's a place where perhaps, unless you were really, really thorough, you would miss it. But these looked like she'd been injected with something in a place where no one would see. Also, he discovered an air bubble inside kind of Kayley's, like this puncture wound. There was an air bubble. And if you know anything about, giving injections, if air bubbles get in to your bloodstream during medical intervention, it can be very, very serious. Anyway, they didn't formally investigate that. There wasn't an investigation at all of Liam, of Timothy, and now of Kayley. But at Nottingham Hospital, she did recover. So Allitt had not killed Kayley. The case that really opened everyone's eyes to what Beverley was actually doing when it eventually came to trial was the case of 5-month-old Paul Crampton. He became Allitt's next victim on March the 20th, 1991. Again, he was admitted just for observation, for tests and things. He had a respiratory infection in his bronchial passages. But he was ready to go home. He was doing well. He was ready to go home. But again, with Beverley Allitt in attendance, when she was by herself, she summoned help to Paul's bedside. And it was weird. They couldn't understand it because he appeared to be suffering from insulin shock, that his insulin levels, that control blood sugar, were massively high. They were all over the place. And this put him into almost a coma on 3 separate occasions. But the valiant efforts of the doctors there on Ward 4 saved his life. He was then taken to Nottingham Hospital and Allitt went with him. She went with him. But she couldn't do any more damage. And Paul was extremely fortunate to have survived the multiple traumas that Allitt had put him through, because he went into a near coma on 3 separate occasions. His insulin levels were massively high, and at trial, just how high they were, we'll get there, became known. The very next day, 5-year-old Bradley Gibson, who had pneumonia, so he was sick, went into unexpected cardiac arrest on Ward 4. He was saved again by the resuscitation team. Subsequent blood tests showed, like Paul, his insulin levels were massively high and they couldn't understand it. He then had a heart attack, he had a cardiac arrest. So he was a very sick little boy, but still, suffering from severe heart failure. The doctors couldn't understand it. Again, he was another child that was transferred to Nottingham Hospital. He was okay, but the staff at Ward 4 at Grantham Hospital were becoming suspicious by this point. They just couldn't understand it. On March 22nd, 1991, 2-year-old Yik Hung Chan turned blue and appeared in considerable distress when Allitt, after being alone with him, raised the alarm. Again, he was transferred to another hospital where he recovered. And then this one is heartbreaking. Allitt then turned her attention to Katie and Becky Phillips, who were premature babies, little preemie babies, who'd survived against the odds. They were just 2 months old when Allitt got involved, shall we say. Becky developed gastroenteritis, and as she was tiny, 2-month-old preemie baby, her parents decided to take her to hospital, and she was admitted to Ward 4 on April the 1st, 1991. Allitt again promised the parents that she personally would take good care of their little precious Becky. But 2 days after admittance, Allitt raised the alarm yet again, and Becky looked like hyperglycemic, looked like she was suffering from low blood sugar. They couldn't understand how she was slipping away in front of their eyes. She was cold to the touch. But they let her go home. They said, no, she's sick, but she's fine. She can be at home. There's, nothing more we can do, really. You can care for her at home. She's okay. But during the night at home, Becky went into convulsions. She cried out with apparent pain, but doctors suggested she had that common baby complaint, colic. It's just colic. But she died. Sadly, she died during the night in her parents' arms. At autopsy, this was another case where the pathologist couldn't find a cause of death. and they just put it down to, well, she's a little preemie baby, she's weak, she had this gastroenteritis and she just didn't recover. It was just unfortunate. Her body wasn't strong enough to fight whatever was going on inside her. But Becky was a twin, and she had a surviving sister called Katie. She was admitted to Grantham Hospital as a precaution because Becky had just died of gastroenteritis. So, this could be catching, this could be contagious. Oh, but unfortunately for her, Allitt was again in attendance. It wasn't long before she was summoning the resuscitation team to revive little baby Katie, Becky's surviving sister. She'd stopped breathing. Efforts to revive Katie were successful. This resuscitation team were earning their pay, I can tell you that. 2 days later, though, she suffered another attack, which resulted in the complete collapse of her little, delicate lungs. And preemie babies, they tend to suffer from lung weakness. And again, this is something that they put down to Katie being a preemie baby. Following another revival effort, though, she was transferred to the bigger Nottingham hospital, where it was found she had 5 broken ribs. That was the cause of the lung collapse. In addition, she suffered from brain damage due to lack of oxygen in these respiratory crises. In a supreme twist of irony, though, Katie and Becky's mother, Sue Phillips, was so grateful at the valiant efforts of Beverley Allitt in caring for her daughters, for saving Katie's life, or Sue thought. She asked Beverley to become Katie's godmother. Alec accepted willingly, despite having inflicted partial paralysis, cerebral palsy, and sight and hearing damage to the infant due to the injuries that Allitt had given poor little Katie and the oxygen deprivation. There were 4 more victims, but all following the same pattern. And this high incidence of just unexplained respiratory crises in a ward where children weren't at the point of death really did start to raise the alarm. And the staff, they were looking around at each other. Is somebody doing this? Is somebody a killer? Is somebody on our team, on our ward, a murderer? They didn't want to think that. And they certainly didn't suspect the lovely, hard-working Beverley, at least for the time being. But Beverley Allitt's killing spree was brought to an end with the death of 15-month-old Claire Peck on April 22nd, 1991. So she'd done all of this in 2 months. She had asthma. She'd always had asthma, and she did require breathing assistance at times. But while in Allitt's care, for only a few minutes that Allitt was left alone with her, Claire suffered from a cardiac arrest. The resuscitation team revived her successfully, but again, when left alone with Beverley Allitt, Claire suffered a second attack from which she could not be revived. Now, an autopsy declared that Claire had died from natural causes, but it was this death that it triggered an investigation, a formal investigation on Ward 4. And this was initiated by Dr. Nelson Porter, who is just alarmed by the high number of deaths and respiratory crises that had happened in this otherwise non-deadly children's ward. At first, they thought there was some kind of airborne virus because they just couldn't understand, and they didn't want to believe that one of their own could be responsible from this. And because the autopsy was just inconclusive, They didn't know what to think. There was nothing found. Like the majority of people on that ward, staff and patients, did not suffer from these deadly crises. It was only when Beverley Allitt was in attendance that there was a problem. Anyway, at autopsy, though, of Claire, tests did show abnormally high potassium levels in baby Claire's blood. Upon further investigation of toxicology, lidocaine also was found in her system, a drug used during cardiac arrests, but never given to a baby because it's too strong for them. It can kill them. So police were finally called to Ward 4 by the medical staff on April the 30th. And very, very quickly, an investigation of who was there at the time of these respiratory crises in these kids. Beverley Allitt was there for every single one. So she was suspended from her duties and a formal police investigation occurred. Police superintendent assigned to the investigation was Stuart Clifton, and he, from the get-go, he was an experienced detective. He suspected foul play and he looked at all the cases carefully. He put an experienced team together under Stuart's guidance. They rooted out these problems. Some really good police work went on here. They took all the cases of everything, all these respiratory crises of all these kids, every single one, for the last 2 months, since February, since that very first victim, Liam Taylor, lost his life. The case that really stood out to Stuart and his team was that of Paul Crampton. They'd still had some blood from Paul in the lab, and that was sent for specialist testing. Remember, he had those unusually high insulin levels that the staff couldn't understand at the time. But this specialist testing revealed that Paul had, wait for this, 43,147 milliunits of insulin in his blood. This is one of the highest levels of insulin ever discovered in a toxicology test. So they knew that this wasn't a natural occurrence. They knew somebody was directly killing children, killing babies. Also, they found that of these kids that had suffered these respiratory arrests, there was missing nursing logs. You know, after every treatment, after every injection, every medication, every observation, nurses fill in a report. You know, they track your progress on a log. But some of those, for these kids that had suffered this respiratory arrest, were missing. So there was 25 separate suspicious episodes across 13 victims, 4 of whom were dead. And the common denominator, all of them, was Beverley Allitt. But after a lengthy investigation in November 1991, Beverley was still suspended from work at this point. They charged her with 4 counts of murder and 11 of grievous bodily harm. Allitt, on arrest, was calm. She was caught on camera, smiling. She denied, under interrogation, denied any part in these attacks. All she'd been was a caring nurse, trying to care for these really sick children, doing her very best for them. All she'd ever done is cared for these really, really sick children. A search of her home revealed those missing nursing logs. She'd kept them. She hadn't destroyed them. She'd kept them. Why? Was this some kind of trophy? Further extensive background checks of Beverley Allitt showed that she was a lifelong attention seeker, and it was in her medical records that it was suspected that she had a mental health problem consistent with Munchausen's syndrome. But what she'd gone on to develop is Munchausen's syndrome by proxy. When you're doing it to yourself, where you've got physical or psychological symptoms that are self-induced or just made up. When you're doing it to others, though, you're doing it again to gain attention. At a trial, an expert professor said it's unusual for somebody to have both conditions, but Beverley did. She'd resorted to this killing spree because of her desire to be noticed, of her desire to be the perfect nurse, the perfect carer, the person who would do the most for these very, very sick children. That's what she wanted to appear as. But in actual fact, she was just a cold-hearted baby killer. While she was awaiting trial, despite visits and assessments, psych evals, she refused to talk about anything that she'd done. As she waited her trial, she developed anorexia nervosa, and this is a further indication of her troubled psychological state. By the time of her trial, she'd lost 70 pounds, and she literally was a shadow of her former self. Eventually, due to delays due to Beverley's illnesses, the trial started on the 15th of February 1993 at Nottingham Crown Court. The prosecution demonstrated to the jury how she'd been present at every single suspicious respiratory episode back there between February and April 1991. And just the lack of episodes, everything was fine when Beverley wasn't on shift. Evidence about the massively high readings of insulin and potassium were put forward. She was accused of cutting off her victims' oxygen, either by smothering or tampering with the machines, which might be why alarms weren't sounding in some of these cases. Professor Roy Meadow explained Munchausen's syndrome and Munchausen's syndrome by proxy. Allitt had demonstrated these symptoms since her early childhood. It was his opinion that Allitt was uncurable and that she was a clear danger to everybody and she should go to prison and never be released. The trial lasted nearly 2 months and Allitt only attended 16 days due to illness. She didn't care. She didn't want to listen. She wasn't interested. She just laughed it off. And actually, she was probably enjoying the attention that the trial was giving her in the media. But eventually, on May 23rd, 1993, Allitt was given 13 life sentences for murder and attempted murder. At the time, it was the harshest sentence ever delivered to a female. But according to Judge Latham, it was commensurate with the horrific suffering of the victims and their families. The judge told Allitt that she was a serious danger to society and was unlikely to ever be considered for parole. However, rather than going to prison, Allitt was deemed so mentally ill, she was incarcerated at Crampton Secure Hospital in Nottingham, which is a high security facility with individuals who are seriously dangerous but detained under the UK's Mental Health Act. While there, she began her attention seeking again. She just can't help it. She ingested ground glass. She poured boiling water over herself. But interestingly, and why I've chosen to do this case today, in the UK, instead of just putting you away forever, in the majority of cases, murderers do eventually get the opportunity to apply for parole. Her minimum sentence for all of these counts was 30 years, and that's due up. And in August 2021, so just a few months ago, the parents of one of her victims, who suffered from lifelong brain damage at the hands of Beverley Allitt, feared that the law would let them down and free Allitt. So they went to the media. They appeared in various newspaper outlets. But a spokesperson for the parole board told the press and the parents that Allitt's case has never been referred to them. She has not, up to the current time, applied for parole. If she does want to apply for parole, there is some good news that she's currently serving her time in a secure mental health facility. But she cannot be eligible for parole while she's still there. She would have to be assessed and deemed mentally competent enough to go to a regular prison rather than in hospital. If she's deemed mentally competent and returned to prison, it would have to be referred all the way up to the Secretary of State, because due to the appalling nature of her crimes against little babies, she has been placed on the Home Office list of criminals who may never be eligible for parole. Beverley occasionally makes the news, but in the main, people have forgotten Beverley, except for the families and the friends, the loved ones of those little kids that Beverley murdered in cold blood, and the ones that were left severely, mentally and physically disabled at her hand. Horrible case. Tugs at the heartstrings, this one, I think, because it's little babies. Little babies. Let me know what you think in the comments. It's goodbye from Miss Tillington and Miss Cassie Springer. Bye, guys. Bye, bye, bye.